What's up? Today we're gonna go over the best opening for 2025 to crush your opponents. It is aggressive, dangerous, easy to learn, and unknown by your opponents. Now we're talking about this position, which comes out of the first move pawn to e4, and as black responds symmetrically, you continue in a standard fashion, knight f3, and now lots of your opponents, especially on lower rating levels, are gonna play pawn to d6. Because instead, if they choose to play the main line of knight to c6, that leads to a ton of theory in the Italian game, Danish Gambit and whatnot, so d6 seems to be a lot more practical for black, just to defend this pawn for sure, plus they're ready to just develop normally, and a cherry on the cake, they're ready to bring their bishop out to g4, which amateur players love so much, and pin your knight this way. So how are you going to crush this? We're going to crush this by employing, strangely enough, the Danish Gambit. And the Danish Gambit is not as good as Danish Bakery, but it's still good enough to roast your opponents. What you're gonna do here is playing d4, hitting his center, therefore black is almost forced to take. Now all of a sudden you don't recapture, but instead you offer one more pawn for black because you seek quick development and attack. Black captures it, and once again you don't recapture, but you just keep doubling down on your quick development. You offer black to capture this final pawn on b2, and after that you can quite see the point of the Danish Gambit. By the way, strictly speaking, this is not called the Danish Gambit, as Danish Gambit is when you employ the same thing right on the second move. But the ideas are all the same. So let me show you, by the way, the Danish Gambit just so that you understand what I'm talking about. The actual Danish Gambit is played on the second move. Instead of going knight f3, white starts gambiting pawns right away with d4 and all this sequence of gambit moves. Now, the point of this gambit is that you gain a lot of activity in open lines. You've got this bishop hitting along this diagonal, therefore black can't easily develop his own bishop on f8 because it's got to guard this pawn. We've got this bishop on c4, which is very active, and white is ready to bring the knight over there and to increase the pressure, or in some lines to play queen b3 and develop a battery against this pawn. Overall, white has huge activity and huge opportunities for his future attack. What saves the day for black in the Danish Gambit quite often is an idea to bring the bishop out, delivering this check, which means that black gains a tempo for his development, and then on the next move black can bring the knight out, and he's ready to castle and to sleep well at night. So that's how black often avoids any immediate devastation against the Danish Gambit. But now let's come back to our stuff. If you start off by going knight f3 and your opponent responds with a d6, and you then start this whole sequence, you get into a very similar position, but the only difference be that now this pawn on d6 obstructs development of this bishop, and black can't jump over it and deliver this check to your king. Which means that you actually get an improved version of the Danish Gambit, and the Danish Gambit itself was quite dangerous, but now black is in big troubles. Plus, our knight from f3 is actually a very useful piece. In lots of the variations, it's going to go forward to g5 or even e5 sometimes and hit this pawn on f7, which is one of the main motifs of your attack here. This f7 pawn is weak. It's the direct doorway to the king, and want to attack it again, either by adding the knight over here or by adding the queen over here and creating this diagonal along this file. And overall, just one inaccurate move by black often leads to an immediate devastation. Let me show you a funny example of that, which is one of the main lines, by the way, of this opening. In most cases, black actually refused to accept the final sacrifice because they realized that they fall way behind in development and they try to develop instead, or at least they realize that you want to probably attack this pawn, so they try to secure it somehow. And one of the ways for black that feels really secure is going pawn h6, because now white can't go knight g5 anymore, kind of like in the fried liver attack, and can't attack this pawn. So it looks like a very safe move for black, and yet the truth is right the opposite. Here you start the hurricane with bishop takes f7. Now black's got to recapture. Now it looks like black is still completely fine, but you can blow their mind by going knight to e5. Now that's another check to the king, and the first question is, hey, is white playing give up chess? Can I just take this one more knight? And the question is no, because that would lose the queen. So we're taking advantage of this pin, which means that the king has to move. And in most cases, your opponents are going to drop it back to e8, back to safety, supposedly, which is the exact opposite case in reality. After queen h5, that's another check to the king. It's got to go. And now queen f7 actually wins the game. The queen is supported, and it's game over. By the way, this is not some cheap trick. It is actually a winning line, and black is indeed defenseless. And if the king goes right here, then you can win with knight to g6, delivering fork, winning the rook, and continuing your attack after that. If instead black wants to do something else, what can they do? They can go back, can go here, can go here because it's controlled by the knight, they could bite the bullet and just go forward. And the following variation is really fascinating. You just go after the king. You play queen f3 check first. The king has to now capture the knight. And it's actually not that easy to checkmate the king yet, even though it's centralized. Because we can't go here, it's controlled by the bishop. If instead you play a bishop f4, which also looks nice, the king will just retreat back, to safety, to e6, and maybe all the way back. So it's not a good option either. And what wins for white is actually playing queen f7, a very sophisticated move, which takes away all these squares, meaning that black can't go back with his king. And you're ready to just now attack it with bishop f4 or pawn f4, whatever. And now the king has no way back, and it is indeed defenseless for black. Let's say they go knight f6, can play pawn f4, just hitting the king. Now it's going to keep capturing something, knight to c3. Pretty nice way to develop a knight to c3 while also delivering this check. If king goes here, here comes another beautiful sack. Once again, the king was ready to possibly retreat back somewhere there, and we play bishop e3 to stop that, but also to, push the king even further closer to our position. So after the king takes here, we once again lock the door, lock the way out by going queen to c4, so the king can still not escape there, and it creates the checkmating threat of knight to d1. And overall, quite a funny position. The king is just walking around, and the rest of the army just couldn't care less. And black's got to stop this knight d1 threat, which is a checkmating threat. The way to do that would be bishop g4. And now you can finish it off in style with rook d1. That's the shortest way to win, strangely enough. You give up the rook, and now you still get to the point where you checkmate him by the knight from d1. Quite a funny example. It's crazy to think that this is a very realistic variation for you to play in a practical game of chess. Interestingly enough, similar tactics may occur in another variation. If, let's say, black decides to take on b2, you recapture, and now once again your opponent realizes that, maybe you want to bring the knight forward. Say if he goes knight f6, sometimes you can just go there and go after this pawn. Might feel unpleasant for black. Therefore, instead, they may decide to go bishop g4, pinning your knight so that it can't jump forward anymore. But then you employ all the same tactics. Bishop takes f7, king takes, and now knight to e5. So you make the least expected moves of all. So knight e5 ignores the spin and gives up a knight, seemingly, which is not the case. We already know that the knight cannot be captured. That will lose the queen right there. So this combo definitely comes as a ball from the blue, really unreal for your opponent to foresee it. And now the king has to go because it's under check. Then you get your bishop back. And although you don't checkmate your opponent instantly, but the king has moved, therefore it can't castle anymore. It's going to stay there. Then we're going to castle, play e5 at some point and go for the killing attack. So that should be easily winning for you. Okay, now let's go to one of the main lines, which is also a very funny line. So again, we go into knight f3, our opponent responds with d6, and now we start hitting him with the Danish Gambit, kind of Danish Gambit. Bishop c4, and let's say he takes here, or maybe he goes knight f6, let's say knight f6. Okay, now your opponent probably expects you to take over here, right? If he played the knight move, he attacked this pawn, and what could be more natural than to recapture? But you surprise your opponent by going pawn e5. You want to open up the game, he recaptures, thinking that you're going to take here or trade queens, but your opponent is never going to have an easy life here. You always surprise him this time. Bishop takes f7. After bishop takes, you attack the king, and it can't move away, because if it captures the bishop, it'll be deflected from the defense of the queen, and you're going to pick up the queen and win the game. Which means that your opponent is left with no choice but to march forward with the king to e7, where it's deadly exposed. Now at this point, you could trade queens, but you don't really want that, because you want to keep attacking, and you want to save queens on the board, so you play queen b3 to avoid the exchange, and also to support the bishop on f7 so that black can't capture it. And now, with super precise play, maybe that black can somehow defend his king, but of course, in the real game of chess, with this centralized king, which also obstructs development, of his other pieces, I'd say that black is probably done. For example, if black goes knight c6, there's also a pretty funny move. You can play pawn to c3. I mean, black definitely expected you to capture by the knight and develop the knight at the same time. But in this case, it's better for white to capture by the pawn, because that, strangely enough, opens up this diagonal, which is nearly a checkmate. And black is quite defenseless. They usually go something like knight a5, trying to counterattack. but it's, it all doesn't help. Bishop a3, check to the king, and black is done. The king has to keep going forward, and now you can win with queen e6 checkmate, or knight e5 is a more fascinating checkmate. So it's just crazy how in lots of these sub-variations you have all these tricks and traps all over the place. Black plays seemingly decent moves, but he's quite often devastated. What is the most popular way of black to handle this kind of a variation? And also let me address the elephant in the room, like what does Stockfish says about this position? Well, actually Stockfish says that it's about equal. And indeed, with proper moves, black should probably be able to defend it, but it's always harder to defend, and for you just go forward, develop, attack. For black it's much harder to find those tricky, precise moves to keep him in the game. Now, in reality, in the majority of the cases, black refuses to take here because it's indeed quite good for you, really. If they take here, that just adds one more piece to your attack with a tempo. That's pretty cool. So you're always happy, basically, if they take there. And instead, they try to play bishop e6. By doing so, they try to secure their f7 square and neutralize this pressure. Plus, when you're up material, generally it is recommended to trade off pieces. Therefore, bishop e6 looks like a move that hits all these check marks for black, and it's just a good move to play. But after this exchange, we never let your opponents to break free, and we play queen b3, which is a double attack to this pawn as well as this pawn on b7. We kind of capitalize on the fact that for lack of the bishop there on c8, these both squares are undefended, and we take advantage of that. In most cases, your opponents play the move queen c8, which looks like the decent solution to defend these both pawns, but it's just way too passive and it's simply bad. You don't need to recapture the pawn, although you could with a good game, but knight g5 usually just wins the game for white. You keep attacking this pawn on e6, this time it's attacked twice, and black is quite defenseless already. I mean, they can't easily move this pawn forward because that would just open up this opportunity. Queen to f7 check, it's supported by the knight, and black is done. Therefore, that's not an option. Instead, they go king to e7, and that does the job of defending this pawn, but black is now completely ugly. And you can win however you like, basically. You can just, let's say, get back this pawn on c3 and develop a knight. And the point is, black is just doing like the worst things ever possible, right? In an opening, you're advised to normally develop minor pieces and do not bring out the king and queen early in the game. And black is doing the exact opposite of this, right? They're completely passive and they're shuffling around with their king is got stuck here in the middle of the board. You'll be able to attack it easily. So this should be completely winning for white after any decent moves. But to make things worse for black, they usually follow up with one more mistake, pawn h6. They hope that the knight will retreat to f3, but we know that in this line, we never play what your opponent expects you to play. We instead sack the knight right here on e6, and it turns out that after queen captures, the queen was deflected from this pawn, so now we get this pawn, but more importantly, after that, we win the rook. And then we'll be up material, we'll be attacking this knight, the king still got stuck in the middle of the board, and you got a completely winning game. You'll castle and just enjoy your attack and material advantage and whatnot, and you win. Today we talked about the Danish Gambit against the Philidor Defense when black goes pawn to d6 at this position. And if you really enjoy it, then the downside is that instead of d6, the majority of your opponents will actually still go for the main line with knight to c6. So if you wish to play the Danish Gambit, then instead of knight f3, you can actually play it right here, right on the second move. And it is still a dangerous weapon for black. If you know what you're doing, this can be deadly. I've got another video about the classical Danish Gambit, which you can check out right here. And if you want to improve at chess beyond openings, feel free to check out this free masterclass by clicking over there. Either way, have a great rest of the day. Take care.